So much has changed, yet this remains the same.
The church doors opened at exactly the wrong moment. Not during the vows, not during the rings. During the part where the officiant asks if anyone has a reason, the two of them shouldn't be married. Nobody ever expects someone to actually answer that question. But on a Saturday afternoon in June, 200 guests turned around in their seats to see a woman in a plain gray coat walking slowly up the aisle of a wedding she had not been invited to. Her heels made almost no sound against the old stone floor. That was the strangest part, several guests would say later. Not that she was there, that she was so quiet about it. Because 6 years earlier, that woman had a funeral, closed casket, an obituary in the local paper, 3 paragraphs long, with a photograph from a family barbecue 2 summers before she disappeared. A headstone with her name on it, in a cemetery 40 minutes from where the groom now stood frozen at the altar, his hand still holding his bride's. Her name was Renata Cole, and she was very much alive. For 6 years, everyone who loved her had grieved a version of the truth that was only half accurate. She had died, in the sense that the woman she used to be never really came back. But the body in that grave, the one her husband had personally identified at the morgue, wasn't hers. It never had been. Before we get into how a woman came back from the dead to stop a wedding, and why her husband spent 6 years believing she was gone, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Renata Cole met Dean Whitfield at a charity gala the fall she turned 32. She wasn't the type who usually attended galas. She'd been dragged along by a coworker who insisted the open bar alone was worth the ticket price. Renata, exhausted from long hours as a forensic accountant at a regional bank, agreed mostly because she hadn't left her apartment for anything but work in 3 weeks. Dean was easy to notice in a room like that, not because he was the loudest person there, but because he had a gift for making whoever he was talking to feel like the only interesting person in the building. He asked questions. He remembered answers. When Renata mentioned, almost as an aside, that she spent her days tracing discrepancies in loan portfolios, most men would have changed the subject within 30 seconds. Dean leaned in and asked her to explain exactly how she found them, then listened to the whole answer. She'd think about that a lot later. How good he was at listening to precisely the kind of information that would matter more than either of them could have guessed that night. They dated a year and a half before he proposed. It wasn't rushed. It felt steady, methodical, even the way she was. Her friends joked she'd finally found a man who could keep up with her spreadsheets. Her father, meeting Dean over dinner, pulled her aside afterward and said, "He listens when you talk. That's rarer than you think." Dean worked at Whitfield Financial, an investment firm his father, Harold, had built from nothing over 3 decades. By the time Renata met Dean, Harold had mostly stepped back. Though he kept an office he still used several days a week, and retained signature authority on some of the firm's oldest, highest-value client accounts. Renata liked Harold gruff in a way that read as honest rather than cold. At the engagement dinner, he raised a glass and told the table that Dean had finally found someone with more sense than he had, which Dean laughed off a half-second too late, a detail Renata filed away without examining too closely at the time. They married at a small vineyard ceremony, 60 guests, on a warm October afternoon. Her mother cried through the entire thing, already sick by then with the illness that would slowly claim more of her over the following years. Her father walked her down the aisle and told her, quietly, before the music started, that he'd never seen her look more certain of anything. A line she'd replay constantly in the years to come, wondering how certainty could feel so total in one moment and be so completely upended in another. For 4 years, that certainty seemed earned. Dean remembered her father's chemotherapy schedule when he was diagnosed with prostate cancer in their second year of marriage, driving her to appointments without being asked. He supported her decision to leave the bank and start an independent accounting practice, even through a year of inconsistent income. He wasn't perfect, he forgot anniversaries, worked too many weekends, disappeared into his phone at dinner sometimes, but none of it read as a warning sign. It read as marriage. The real warning signs, when they came, didn't look like warning signs at all. They looked like numbers that didn't add up, the kind only someone trained to notice would catch. It started with a checkbook. Renata went into Dean's home office one evening looking for one to mail a charity donation before a tax deadline, and found, tucked beneath old utility bills in his bottom desk drawer, a manila folder labeled only with a client's initials and a date, containing transfer records that didn't match anything she recognized from the firm's public filings. She told herself it was nothing, some internal reconciliation process she didn't fully understand. She put it back exactly where she found it, mailed her donation with a different checkbook, and told herself to let it go. She didn't let it go. 3 weeks later, she was back in that drawer, this time deliberately. Over the following months, checking only when Dean traveled for work, always returning documents to their exact original position, she found 7 folders. Client accounts, mostly belonging to older clients unlikely to scrutinize statements closely, showing transfers that moved money in circles. Funds would leave one account, appear briefly in another, then move again, sometimes ending up in shell entities with official-sounding names like Whitfield Bridge Holdings and Cornerstone Advisory Partners. Statements were generated showing clients their expected returns, returns that existed only on paper, funded by other clients' principal rather than actual investment performance. Renata recognized the pattern because she'd seen a version of it before, professionally, years earlier as a junior analyst. A slow, patient Ponzi structure, the kind built precisely to avoid detection. Dean's name appeared on some documents, as any senior partners would in the normal course of business. So did a compliance officer named Trevor Ashby, whom Renata had always found unpleasantly slick without ever having a specific reason. So did an account manager named Louis Perry, quieter, more nervous. And on the oldest documents, dating back nearly a decade, well before she'd even met Dean, was Harold's own signature, in his distinctive old-fashioned cursive. Renata spent months quietly building what she thought of privately as a case file, though she never let herself fully articulate what it was for. She photographed documents when Dean traveled. She cross-referenced client names against public records late at night at her own office. Eventually, she opened a safety deposit box at a bank 2 towns over, under her maiden name, Renata Ashworth, a detail from before her marriage known only to her attorney and longtime family friend, Walter Grimes. She copied everything onto a flash drive, along with a handwritten, dated summary of what she'd found, and locked it away. She told herself she was protecting herself, in case the firm ever collapsed under the weight of whatever this was. What she hadn't decided was what to actually do with any of it: confront Dean directly, go to the SEC, or keep telling herself there was still some innocent explanation buried in there she simply hadn't found yet. She never got the chance to decide on her own terms. The call came on a rainy Thursday night, 3 weeks after she'd finished loading that drive, while she drove home from a late client meeting. An unknown number, local area code. A man who identified himself only as a former Whitfield financial compliance employee. "You need to listen carefully," he said, "and you need to not ask questions because I don't have time to answer them." Renata pulled onto the shoulder of Route 9, hazard lights on, rain hammering the windshield hard enough to blur the tree line beyond the guardrail. He told her people at the firm knew she'd been in the files. That Dean knew, and had known for 2 weeks, a fact that landed like something physical. 2 weeks of her husband knowing exactly what she'd found and saying nothing, sleeping beside her every night. He told her that whatever she thought she understood about the transfers, other people understood it too, people who had far more to lose than a comfortable lifestyle, and that they'd already started discussing what to do about the problem she represented. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt though her hands were shaking. "What kind of problem?" "It means you need to disappear," he said, "before you become a liability instead of just a wife who found something she wasn't supposed to find." "Who are you?" she asked, "and why are you telling me this?" A long pause. "Because somebody warned me once," he finally said, "and I didn't listen and it cost me almost everything. I'm not going to make that mistake twice." The call ended less than 90 seconds after it began. Renata sat on that shoulder for nearly 10 minutes, trying to decide whether she'd just been the target of an elaborate hoax, or whether the ground underneath the last 6 years of her life had just cracked open. She almost drove home. She almost told herself it was a scare tactic, maybe even from Dean himself, testing whether she'd found the files. What changed her mind was the headlights. A second car pulling onto the shoulder behind hers, engine running, headlights off. Not passing, not stopping to help, just sitting there 30 yards back waiting. She left her phone on the passenger seat and her purse in the footwell, deliberately, a decision that felt like pure instinct at the time, though she'd later understand it as one of the smartest things she did that night, since a phone could be tracked in ways she wouldn't fully appreciate until her federal debriefings much later. She had, tucked into her coat pocket, nearly $400 in emergency cash she'd started carrying weeks earlier without fully admitting why. She got out on the passenger side, away from the road, and walked into the tree line, moving as fast and quietly as she could in low heels on wet ground, rain soaking through her coat within minutes, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts as she forced herself not to run, reasoning, in some clear-headed corner of her panicked mind, that running would be louder and more visible than a fast, deliberate walk through the dark. She didn't look back. She cut through woods she vaguely remembered from a hiking trail years earlier, one she and Dean had walked together once, early in their relationship, a detail that struck her, even in the middle of her terror, as a strange and bitter irony, and eventually emerged, an hour later, onto the outskirts of a small town called Millbrook, a place she'd driven through countless times but never once stopped in. She spent that first night in the covered entryway of a closed hardware store, soaked and shaking, replaying the caller's words over and over, turning them from every angle, searching for a version of events where this was all an overreaction, something she could laugh about eventually. By morning, cramped and exhausted, watching the first employees of a nearby diner arrive for the breakfast shift, she'd made the decision that would define the next 6 years of her life. She wasn't going home. Her car went into the Kessler River sometime that night. Whether driven, pushed, or simply released down the embankment was never conclusively established. 11 days later, a body was recovered downstream, badly affected by time in the water, wearing clothing consistent with what Renata had owned, carrying no identification. Investigators, working with a grieving husband eager for answers, didn't push for more than dental records matched somewhat hastily by an overworked medical examiner's office. Dean identified the remains within an hour of being shown photographs, without requesting DNA confirmation, something his attorney would later call understandable given the emotional circumstances, a phrase that made Renata, sitting in a courtroom years afterward, want to laugh in a way that had nothing to do with humor. The funeral was held 8 days later. Renata's father, still recovering from his own cancer treatment, had to be helped to his seat. Her mother, too ill to travel, would die 18 months later, still believing her daughter had drowned in the Kessler River on a rainy September night, a fact Renata wouldn't learn until months after it happened, delivered secondhand by an investigator instead of arriving the way it should have, surrounded by family. For 2 weeks, Renata lived on emergency cash, taking cash-only shifts washing dishes at a diner 3 hours from home, sleeping in a women's shelter under a name she made up on the spot, giving no details about where she'd come from or why. She knew the cash wouldn't last, and knew the anonymous caller's warning meant she couldn't safely reach out to anyone from her old life, not even her own attorney, without risking exposing exactly where she was. The decision to go to federal authorities came 3 weeks later, when she read her own obituary in a local newspaper left behind in a diner booth. 3 paragraphs. A photo from a family barbecue 2 summers earlier, Renata laughing at something out of frame, a version of herself she almost didn't recognize anymore, sitting in that vinyl booth in borrowed clothes, hair still damp from a shelter shower. She'd later described that moment as the first time she understood the scale of what she was up against. If Dean, or whoever was behind that warning call, was willing to let a funeral happen without pushing for real confirmation, then whatever she'd found wasn't a minor discrepancy. It was something people were prepared to bury permanently. She called the FBI's regional field office 2 days later from a payphone outside a gas station, feeding it quarters she'd earned washing dishes. She didn't give her real name at first. The agent who eventually took her case, Diane Acaffer, sharp-eyed and unflappable in a way Renata would come to deeply appreciate, would later say she'd fielded strange calls before, but never one that opened with, "I need to report that I'm not actually dead." What followed took far longer than Renata expected. Establishing her identity required documentation she no longer had easy access to. Verifying her claims required cross-referencing the fragments of financial evidence she could describe from memory. Since the flash drive remained locked away in a box she couldn't risk visiting, and determining whether her life was still in danger required an investigation quiet enough not to tip off whoever had made that warning call in the first place. Acaffer made the case to her superiors that Renata wasn't just a victim, but a critical witness in a growing securities fraud investigation into Whitfield Financial, one that had, unbeknownst to Renata, already been quietly opened 6 months before her disappearance, following an anonymous tip that would later turn out to have come from the same man who'd called to warn her, a former junior compliance analyst named Curtis Bell. Renata was placed under a limited witness protection arrangement built for financial crime witnesses rather than the dramatic relocation programs of movies. A new identity, modest support during the transition, and discreet periodic check-ins, contingent on staying invisible until the case was strong enough to protect her. She became Diane Foster, a name she picked in a moment of panic, borrowing it from the agent sitting across the table, a small, strange tribute to the person who'd believed her when almost nobody else had the chance to. She moved 2 states away, took a small apartment above a laundromat, and found work as a bookkeeper for a family-owned hardware distribution company. Quiet, unglamorous work that felt, over time, like the opposite of everything her old life had become, and that she came to find genuinely soothing in its predictability. The years that followed weren't dramatic. There were no car chases, no close calls that made for exciting television. What there was instead was a long, grinding loneliness Renata later said was harder in some ways than the fear that started it all. She couldn't call her father, whose health kept declining, without risking both his safety and the investigation. She couldn't attend her mother's funeral 18 months in, and instead learned of it 3 weeks late, from Agent Acaffer, sitting in a federal conference room instead of surrounded by family the way it should have happened. There was one close call she rarely discussed publicly, though it appeared in case notes. In her 3rd year as Diane Foster, a former professional acquaintance visited the small city for a conference, and the two crossed paths in a hotel lobby coffee shop. The woman studied Renata's face for an uncomfortably long moment before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, you just look exactly like someone I used to know." Renata smiled, said something noncommittal, and left as quickly as she reasonably could, her heart pounding for hours afterward. It never went anywhere, a small mercy she never stopped being grateful for. She built a small, careful life. One close friend, a coworker named Priscilla who worked at the same hardware distribution company and knew her only as Diane, quiet and reliable in a way that made people trust her without quite knowing why. Priscilla, a divorced mother of two teenagers, eventually became something close to family, inviting Renata to holiday dinners and ordinary Sunday afternoons watching football neither of them particularly cared about. Renata never told her the truth, not fully, though there were nights, especially around the anniversary of the accident, when she came close, sitting on Priscilla's back porch, half a bottle of wine in, the truth sitting right behind her teeth. She dated twice over those 6 years, a mild-mannered pharmacist for 4 months, a more persistent contractor who eventually confronted her directly about what she was so obviously hiding, a conversation that ended things within the week. Both relationships ended the same way, with Renata pulling back before honesty became unavoidable. She told herself it was for their protection as much as her own. She wasn't entirely sure that was true. What kept her going was the investigation itself, moving forward slowly in the background. Agent Okafor's task force built the case piece by piece, subpoenaed bank records, testimony from uneasy former employees, forensic accounting that echoed the very techniques Renata herself had once used professionally, techniques she occasionally, cautiously, offered input on during her periodic debriefings. Harold Whitfield, it turned out, had known about the fraud for years and had kept receiving distributions from it even after retirement, funds that had paid for a lake house he and his late wife bought 6 years earlier. Trevor Ashby had been quietly skimming extra for himself under cover of the larger fraud, funding a gambling habit far beyond his salary. Louis Perry eventually cooperated extensively, providing testimony that filled in timelines Renata's own documentation hadn't covered. Dean kept running the firm's daily operations, using his position, his father's fatting involvement, and the sympathy of a grieving young widower to keep scrutiny at bay. He sold the house they'd shared roughly a year after her funeral, citing an inability to live with the memories, and moved into a newer, larger one purchased partly with funds the task force would later trace back to the very accounts Renata first found. He took an extended break from public appearances for nearly 2 years, behavior everyone read as grief, though Renata, hearing about it secondhand, wondered how much was calculation instead. She learned 4 years in that he was dadding again, news that hit harder than she expected, not out of any lingering romantic feeling, but out of a hollow grief for the life that had been stolen from her twice over. At 5.5 years, she learned he was engaged. Priya Shah met Dean at a professional networking event roughly 2 years after Renata's death, both of them privately counting the minutes until they could leave a panel discussion neither wanted to attend. He was, by every account Priya could later reconstruct, exactly the kind of steady, thoughtful, quietly successful man dadding in her 30s had made her increasingly skeptical existed. He didn't rush things. He was open, or seemed open, about his grief, describing his first wife's death in a car accident with what read as genuine, restrained sorrow, careful never to say too much at once, letting details emerge gradually over their early dates in a way that felt like trust being built slowly. He told her, on their third date, over dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant, that he'd assumed for a long time he wouldn't fall in love again, that some part of him had felt disloyal even considering it, until she came along. Priya, who had lost her own father unexpectedly 5 years earlier, understood grief in a way that made Dean's story feel like common ground rather than a red flag. She didn't push for details about the accident beyond what he offered. She didn't ask to see photographs of Renata, sensing it would be painful for him, though she did, quietly, search Renata's name online once, late one night while Dean slept beside her, and found exactly what he described. A tragic car accident, a promising young accountant, a grieving husband who'd asked for privacy. Nothing that raised any flags for a woman with no reason to suspect there was anything left to find. Priya's family mostly liked Dean. Her mother, a retired schoolteacher, found him a bit reserved but appreciated his financial stability, telling Priya more than once she was glad she'd found someone settled, after years of what her mother diplomatically called interesting choices in previous relationships. Her younger sister, Anjali, 28 and considerably more skeptical by temperament, couldn't quite explain her hesitation beyond a feeling that Dean's grief, however genuine, sounded rehearsed. "He just seems like he's performing being sad about her sometimes," Anjali told Priya once over wine, the two of them curled up on Anjali's couch the way they'd been talking through relationships since high school. "Not like he's lying, just like it's a script he's memorized." Priya dismissed the comment at the time, chalking it up to her sister's general wariness of any man who seemed too polished, a pattern Anjali had displayed with every serious boyfriend Priya had ever brought home. In hindsight, she'd think about that conversation often, turning it over and over, wondering how much of her sister's instinct had actually been picking up on something real. Dean proposed on a beach at sunset, 18 months into the relationship, with a ring he told her had belonged to his grandmother. It had been purchased new 2 months earlier, with funds the task force would eventually trace back to the same fraudulent accounts Renata had first discovered years before. Priya said yes without hesitation. The wedding was planned for the following June, at a church Priya had attended since childhood, with 200 guests and a reception at a nearby vineyard. A life she had every reason to believe was about to begin exactly as she'd imagined since she was a little girl sketching wedding dresses in the margins of her school notebooks. What she didn't know, and what nobody in that church would know until the ceremony itself, was that roughly 8 months before the wedding date, the federal investigation into Whitfield Financial had reached its breaking point. By Renata's 5.5 year as Diane Foster, the case had grown into one of the largest fraud investigations the regional field office had handled in years, dozens of affected accounts, estimated losses in the tens of millions, testimony from multiple former employees. What prosecutors still needed before charging Dean, specifically, was direct, independent corroboration connecting him not just to general oversight of the firm, but to specific knowledge of and participation in the fraud itself. Louis Perry's testimony helped, but a defense attorney could argue he had motive to shift blame upward for his own reduced sentence. That's when Agent Okafor and federal prosecutor Rosalind Chen asked Renata to help retrieve the flash drive from her old safety deposit box, the one piece of independent, contemporaneous evidence that could tie everything together. Renata agreed, nearly 5 years and 8 months after locking it away. Agents first confirmed, through several days of discreet surveillance, that nobody appeared to be watching the location, before escorting her inside, disguised in a hooded jacket and sunglasses, during a quiet weekday morning. The box, still registered under her maiden name through an automatic annual renewal, was untouched, exactly as she'd left it. Once authenticated, those documents, combined with Louis Perry's testimony and Trevor Ashby's own damaging financial records, gave prosecutors everything they needed to file charges against Dean, Harold, and several others connected to the firm. The remaining question was timing. Filing charges publicly meant the record became public almost immediately, creating real risk that Dean, upon learning charges were imminent, would move assets, flee, or otherwise complicate both the prosecution and any restitution to defrauded clients, many of them elderly, some like Constance Farrow, the client whose account had first appeared in that manila folder, now 87. What prosecutors wanted was a public, guaranteed setting where law enforcement could act immediately if Dean tried to run. His upcoming wedding, a known location, a known date, 200 guests making any attempt at flight immediately conspicuous, offered exactly that. Renata wrestled with the decision for weeks, raising her concern about Priya, an innocent woman with no knowledge of any of it, in nearly every planning meeting. "I'm not doing this to hurt her," she told Okafor. "If there was another way to guarantee he couldn't run, I'd take it." "I know," Okafor said, "but there isn't, and she deserves to know the truth before she marries him, not after." That, more than anything, was what finally settled it. The weeks before the wedding were, in some ways, harder than the 6 years of hiding that preceded them. Renata worked with a federal witness coordinator on every detail: how she'd enter, where agents would be positioned, exactly what she was and wasn't legally permitted to say, and how to handle the press attention likely to follow almost instantly. She also, for the first time in nearly 6 years, reunited with her father. It happened in a plain federal conference room, grief counselors on standby. He was 74 now, his cancer in remission, but his body visibly aged beyond what 6 years should have accounted for, hair fully white, a cane resting against his chair. He stared at her for nearly a full minute before either of them spoke. "They told me you were dead," he finally said, his voice breaking. "I sat at your funeral. I watched them lower a casket into the ground with your name on it. Your mother died still crying about it every single day, right up until the end." "I know," Renata said, crying for the first time in front of another person in years. "I'm so sorry. I didn't have a choice. If anyone had known where I was, it could have gotten both of us killed, or compromised everything they needed to actually make this right." He held her for a long time, and later admitted his first instinct, once the shock passed, wasn't anger. It was relief so overwhelming it felt physically disorienting, like a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was possible to set down, a weight that had aged him. He told her quietly, more in 6 years than the previous 2 decades combined. He wasn't invited to the wedding for his own safety and the operations, though he made her promise to call him the moment it was over, a promise she repeated 3 times before she felt he actually believed she meant it. Renata chose her outfit carefully, a plain gray wool coat, unceremonial on purpose. "I'm not trying to make an entrance," she told Akafor, the morning of the wedding, going over final logistics in a hotel parking lot as the sky slowly lightened. "I just need him to see my face. Everything after that takes care of itself." Operational plan called for agents in unmarked vehicles positioned in the church lot by 11, and Renata's arrival timed precisely to the moment in the ceremony when the officiant traditionally asks whether anyone objects. She rode there in a plain government sedan, watching a small town she hadn't seen in 6 years pass by outside the window, a grocery store she used to shop at, a park where she and Dean once had a picnic during the easiest days of their marriage before any of this. The sedan pulled into a spot out of view of the main doors. Akafor turned to her. "Last chance," she said. "You don't have to do this." Renata looked at the church, at guests still arriving, laughing, entirely unaware. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." She stepped out, straightened her coat, and began walking, her heels silent against the gravel, her heartbeat the only sound she could hear. Inside, the ceremony had already begun. The morning had been unremarkable up until it wasn't. Priya got ready in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by nervous, joyful chaos, a steamer running for the dress, someone's toddler nephew being chased out for the 3rd time. Her sister Anjali fastened the long row of buttons up the back of the gown, both of them laughing about something one of the bridesmaids had said, a lightness neither of them would remember without a hollow ache in the months to come. Dean arrived at the church roughly 40 minutes before the ceremony, dressed and composed, greeting guests with the easy warmth that had made him effective, professionally and personally, for as long as anyone could remember. His father, Harold, now 78 and visibly frail, sat in the front row with the help of a home health aide, unaware that federal agents were, at that same moment, finalizing arrest logistics tied directly to charges that included his own name. The ceremony proceeded normally. Vows, exchanged rings, Priya's voice catching as she spoke about finding unexpected love after loss, a line several guests would later find devastatingly ironic in hindsight. And then the moment every wedding treats as pure formality, the officiant asking whether anyone present objects. The silence that followed lasted longer than it should have. Long enough for several guests to notice the large wooden doors at the back of the church slowly opening, admitting a rectangle of daylight and a single silhouetted figure. Renata walked up that aisle slowly, deliberately, her heels making almost no sound against the stone floor. She didn't rush, though her heart pounded hard enough to feel in her throat. Every head turned, A ripple of confused murmuring spread from the back rows forward, guests whispering to each other, craning their necks, trying to figure out who this woman in the plain gray coat could possibly be, arriving during a wedding of all moments and walking with such deliberate, unhurried purpose toward the altar. Renata, Dean said, and it wasn't a question. It was recognition, sudden and total, his voice cracking on the second syllable of a name he hadn't said aloud in years. Priya turned toward him, confused, following his gaze to the woman now standing a few feet away, a woman she'd never seen before, wearing a plain gray coat that clearly hadn't been chosen for celebration, her bouquet still clutched tightly in both hands. "Dean," Priya said, her voice small and uncertain. "Who is that?" "I'm sorry to interrupt," Renata said, her voice calm, carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "but I think everyone here deserves to know the truth before anyone signs anything today." A gasp rippled through the third row. Somewhere near the back, a phone was already recording. "My name is Renata Cole," she continued. "6 years ago I was declared dead. I wasn't. And the man standing at this altar has spent those 6 years building a life on the assumption that I would never come back to ask him why. There's a federal investigation into Whitfield Financial that's been open for years, tied directly to the same circumstances surrounding my disappearance. I'm the witness they've been building this case around. And I imagine, by Monday morning, quite a few people in this room are going to be getting some very uncomfortable phone calls about their accounts." Priya looked down at the ring on her finger as though it had transformed into something entirely different than what she'd believed it to be an hour earlier. "Priya," Renata said, turning to her directly, her voice softening though it lost none of its steadiness. "I need you to know this isn't about you. I don't know you, and you clearly had no idea any of this was true. I'm sorry the timing had to happen this way, but you deserve to know before you married him, not after." The still open doors, unmarked vehicles had already pulled into the lot. Figures in dark jackets made their way calmly up the front steps. Dean took a single step backward, as though some part of him was still calculating an exit that didn't exist. "Dean Whitfield," a voice said from the back of the church, calm and procedural, "we need you to come with us." He didn't resist, though witnesses described him as appearing almost catatonic, his eyes fixed on Renata even as the charges were read. He was led out past rows of guests in a silence so complete the only sound was a single camera shutter, clicking over and over. Harold was taken into custody separately, an agent gently helping him to his feet, another retrieving his fallen cane. Priya stood frozen at the altar for nearly a full minute, still holding her bouquet. "Is it true?" she finally asked. "All of it?" "I wish I could tell you it wasn't," Renata said. "I'm sorry." Priya's mother reached her daughter first, pulling her toward a side room off the sanctuary and jolly close behind, throwing one sharp, protective glance back over her shoulder. Renata remained near the altar briefly, speaking quietly with Agent Okafor and confirming logistics, before being escorted out a side entrance, away from the growing knot of guests already recording, texting, whispering to each other. "Isn't that the wife who died? I remember that story." A handful of guests lingered in the parking lot for nearly an hour afterward, unable to simply drive home as though the morning had been ordinary, clustering near the church steps comparing what they'd seen. One cousin of Priya's, who worked in finance, was already pulling up news alerts on his phone by the time he reached his car, having recognized the name Whitfield Financial from an industry newsletter. A small, cold shock of recognition telling him this was going to be much bigger than a ruined wedding. Harold's home health aide stood frozen near the front steps for several minutes after the agents led him away, uncertain whether her job required her to follow, still holding the light jacket he'd handed her moments before everything happened, oddly warm in her hands amid the chaos. By that evening, the story had begun circulating locally. Within a week, it was national, the kind of headline that seemed almost too dramatic to be real. A woman presumed dead for 6 years, reappearing at her husband's wedding to expose a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Renata gave a single, carefully prepared statement 2 days later, then declined further interviews on her attorney's advice. "I didn't do this for attention," it read in part. I did it because the truth doesn't stay buried just because it's inconvenient for someone else that it does, and because a woman I'd never met deserved to know who she was about to marry before it was too late to matter. The months that followed were consumed by the machinery of a federal case. Dean was charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice, the last tied directly to the phone call that had sent Renata fleeing 6 years earlier. Curtis Bell, tracked down roughly a year into the case, testified in exchange for immunity, corroborating nearly every detail Renata had described from that rainy night. Harold, given his age and health, reached a plea agreement that spared him a lengthy trial, admitting to knowledge of and benefit from the fraudulent scheme in exchange for a reduced sentence. A resolution that left many defrauded clients, some of whom had trusted him personally for decades, some of whom had known him well enough to attend his own late wife's funeral, feeling that justice had been only partially served. Trevor Ashby was convicted on all major counts, including charges tied both to the original fraud and to what prosecutors ultimately characterized, though never fully proved beyond reasonable doubt regarding intent, as an attempt to intimidate and endanger a witness. A phrase that, to Renata, felt like a clinical, bloodless description of a night that had cost her 6 years of her life. Louis Perry, whose cooperation had been essential throughout the investigation, received a significantly reduced sentence, a resolution some defrauded clients criticized publicly as too lenient, though prosecutors defended it as essential to building the broader case. Dean's own trial began just over a year after the wedding, drawing enough media attention to require additional courtroom security. Renata testified for nearly 3 days, walking the jury through the folder, the phone call, the river, and 6 years of a life she wasn't allowed to live. Testimony Rosalind Chen would later call the most credible she'd put on the stand in 20 years of doing the work. Priya testified too, describing, without visible anger toward Renata, the specific, carefully constructed version of Dean's grief and finances he'd maintained for 2 years. The defense, led by a well-regarded white-collar attorney named Preston Lowell, tried to portray Dean as a man who'd trusted his father and the firm's compliance structure too completely, a son who'd inherited a broken system rather than built one. Rosalind Chen dismantled that framing methodically in her closing, walking the jury back through email after email bearing Dean's own direct authorization for transfers that matched, almost line for line, the pattern Renata had first noticed in that manila folder years earlier. This wasn't a man who trusted the wrong people, Chen told the jury. This was a man who built the wrong people's trust in him, on purpose, for years, and then let his own wife take the fall for finding out. The jury deliberated just under 4 days, longer than either side expected given the volume of documentary evidence. The jury foreperson, a retired schoolteacher named Dolores Whitman who kept her own notebook of notes through every day of testimony, later said the turning point for most jurors hadn't come from the financial documents, extensive as they were, but from a single detail in Curtis Bell's testimony. His description of Dean's exact words during the warning call, written down from memory that same night, years earlier, in a personal journal investigators later recovered. A small, human detail that made an otherwise overwhelming mountain of spreadsheets and account numbers feel real in a way numbers alone hadn't quite managed. Dean was ultimately convicted on the majority of charges and sentenced to just under 14 years, with a restitution order both attorneys and financial experts agreed would likely never be fully satisfied given the scope of the losses. At sentencing, given the chance to speak, he offered a brief, carefully worded statement expressing regret for the pain this has caused everyone involved, language that noticeably avoided any direct admission of intent, a choice several observers, including Renata, found almost fittingly consistent with the man they'd all come to understand him to be. Even at the end, still managing the story rather than simply telling the truth. Roughly 2 months after the wedding, Priya and Renata spoke by phone, arranged carefully through their attorneys. both women aware of how easily a conversation like that could go badly. Priya, by then, had moved. She and Dean had been about the way a sister's small, half-formed doubt can turn out to have been right all along, even when nobody, including the person who voiced it, fully understood why at the time. Trust your gut when something feels rehearsed. It doesn't mean you're wrong to have believed someone. It just means it's worth paying attention when a small voice tells you a story is too smooth in places it shouldn't be. If there's one thing worth carrying away from this story, it might be this. The people who hurt us often assume silence means we've disappeared, given up, or been erased entirely. Sometimes it just means we're waiting for the moment when speaking up will actually matter. If you've ever had someone try to write you out of your own story, bury a truth they hoped would stay buried, or assume your silence meant surrender when it didn't, tell us about it in the comments below.